and welcome back to the channel. Sorry for the video being a little delayed. I had some technical difficulties with my capture PC dying and not being a very good time, and then I've been swapping around laptops, seeing what is the best option to continue making videos on. So yeah, but now that that's all sorted out, we can get back to the channel. So today's video is about this very interesting Goodwill find that I picked up quasi recently. The album is A Change of Heart by Golden Avatar, and this seems to be a really interesting album for me personally. So let's get into what this album actually is. So Golden Avatar, or this album actually, is the brainchild of Michael Cassidy. Now, Michael Cassidy was born in New Hampshire in 1949. His mother was a musician, and his grandmother was actually a published songwriter. So he was introduced and enamored with music at an extremely young age. In the 60s, Cassidy would be introduced to philosophy and religion in the 60s, and in 1971 would become a student of enlightenment, and that would go on to basically be the basis of his little album here, A Change of Heart. Now, this is where the info gets a little bit past my knowledge, so I had to do quite a bit of researching and just digging through online forums, blog posts, and stuff like that. So this album was basically produced to promote the Krishna consciousness. Now, if you're not totally 100% sure what that is, basically this is kind of a religious album putting forth the ideas and ideals of a certain religion. The album was actually recorded at Golden Avatar Studios in Los Angeles, and that is actually a temple, the Temple of the Golden Avatar. And the reason that this is called Golden Avatar is because the temple said that yes, he could make the album and put his name on it, but the kind of band name had to be Golden Avatar for one reason or another. I wasn't able to find exact numbers just because the Canadian charts do not have a record going back this far, but apparently the album was popular enough to go gold up in Canada, even though I don't have enough numbers, and was able to push quite a big amount of profit in the UK and Europe. For the US, however, I'm not really sure. There's not a whole lot of metrics on it. In my vinyl hunting and thrift store shopping, this is the first time I've come across this album, so I would gather to say it wasn't extremely popular, considering how many times I've seen Perry Como and some lower Frank Sinatra stuff and Lawrence Welk. It's the first time I've ever seen this album, so it probably was not too popular here in the States. So although Cassidy did sell a sizable number of these albums, he was actually unable to turn a full profit, basically breaking even on the production of this album, which is better than losing money in my opinion. Now, if we look at the back of the album, there's actually quite a interesting little snippet. He gives a special thanks to some recording artists of the time. Those artists being Richie Havens, Stevie Wonder, Neil Diamond, Alfred Ford, George Harrison, and John Fahey. However, the special thanks is actually only for those specific artists contributing to ISKCON projects. Basically, ISKCON is the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. It's just basically other albums of this kind of type, pretty much. If you listen to just a couple of George Harrison songs, you can actually listen to him reference the Krishna in his lyrics, which is pretty interesting, actually. So is this album any good? I think that if you were able to find this at a thrift shop for a couple dollars or a couple pounds or whatever, and it's in pretty decent condition, I'd say, yeah, it's definitely worth a pickup. It's a very interesting album. It's not too common. It's not rare by any means, and it's not worth a whole lot. but it's definitely something interesting to add to the collection, something to kind of talk about, in a couple passing comments. The album itself is not terrible. It's got some moments for sure. In this review, I'm actually pretty much going to skip over the entire album and only talk about the final song. But before we do that, I want to just kind of explain a little bit of the sound of this album. I want to give this album kind of a similar soundscape to early Chicago albums, like Transit Authority 2 and 3. Very similar. It's got some interesting vocals. They're very uninspired. Cassidy, he can obviously sing, but there's no true distinction between his voice and a lot of the other soft 70s rock vocalists of the time. Now, an interesting part of this album is definitely the instrumentation. There is a lot of interesting instruments on this album, and there's actually a list of them on the back here. So we've got, obviously, lead vocals, we've got guitar, piano, we've got organ and synth, bass, drums, congas, electric guitar, soprano, sax, vibes, harp, flutes, and then a brass section of trombones and trumpets, strings, background vocals. It is a plethora of instruments and instrumentals on this album, which is how I kind of liken it to certain Chicago albums for their kind of instrumental focus. However, most of the songs on here are nothing to blink an eye at. It's everything from kind of meh to okay. There's nothing that really stands out in my opinion, except for the last song. But yeah, it's definitely an inspired work and has obviously had a lot of time put into it, but it's nothing that's been, written all too extremely well, and it's just an okay album. Now let's talk about the final song, Time for Going Home. Although Cassidy's vocals are pretty much uninspired throughout the rest of the album, this is definitely his best effort. You can tell that he put a kind of bravado and deepness to his voice into this song more than the others. This was definitely his Comfortably Numb for the album. You could tell that he put the most effort into this last song, and hence probably that's why it is the final song on the album. This album has a very interesting soundscape. There's kind of a cerebral entrance with a droning sitar and synthesizer in the background, and a really interesting electric bass riff that's very simple but extremely driving and helps to move the song along. Cassidy sings along with an assortment of kind of background vocalists and a brass section, which kind of give this kind of Hey Jude kind of feel, where it's a very large, broad, wide soundscape, and it just gives this song a lot of depth that most of the other songs on this album don't actually have, which I think brings this song to my number one off the album. In around the 2-minute 18 mark, there's actually a pretty funky synthesizer solo. Very, very, very interesting. This is the early 70s, and it's a very, very good synthesizer solo as well. There's a lot of syncopation and some interesting rhythms that really kind of brought me into the first. When I was listening to this for the first time, I had to pick the needle up and rewind a little bit. It was very different. It was contrasting to the rest of the album, where it's kind of, out there on the edge, but it was very interesting and very cool. So final thoughts. In my script, I basically just have a header, final thoughts, and then ramble, period. Yeah, so this is a very interesting album. Obviously, what I was drawn in at first at Goodwill was this album art. It's enough to draw anyone in, really. It's kind of reminiscent of some Yes albums, some, interesting drawings on here. Actually, something I do liken it to is actually the orchestral Pink Floyd from the late 90s. The CD, I have it right here. Something similar to this, actually. Where this drawing, I believe, was actually done by the same guy who did some of the Yes artwork for their album covers. And it's kind of a similar vibe, very fairy tale-like, very, this is something, these are images you'd find in Victorian era children's books, and it's very interesting. And there's a design on the front and a design on the back, and it's something that really caught my eye. I knew it was something I had to pick up. I look at it, And then I look at the back of this, and I look at all of the instrumental listings, and I'm like, wow, this has got to be a pretty interesting prog rock album. It isn't. It's soft rock, but still very, very interesting. I had to pick it up. It was a dollar or so, I think, and it was just something I had to pick up. And my curiosity got the better of me, and I would say I'm not disappointed. It's definitely something interesting and fun to have in the collection. Something to, have some friends over and show them, hey, I've got this Krishna-inspired kind of Buddhist album. I'm not a big fan of like Christian contemporary rock. Some of it's okay, but it's usually most of it sounds the same. That's not to hate on any fans out there or the artists themselves. It's just for me, Christian contemporary is a little like modern country or southern pop. It's just very all samey to me. And for a religious album, this is very, very interesting and very different. So I'm glad to have it to the collection. I think that if you were to pop into, if you're here in the States, you find a Goodwill or a Salvation Army, you find this album and it's reasonably priced, $1 to $5, definitely pick this up. It's definitely an interesting conversation piece. It would look very cool framed, I think, on a wall. It's got some beautiful artwork on the front. And to listen to, it's not terrible either. It's a pretty okay album. And that last song is definitely something you should listen to. There are a couple really decent vinyl rips on YouTube already. I'm still figuring out my ripping setup over here, but once that gets set up, this will probably be one of the first albums that I rip, just because this is a really high quality disc. It's not 180 grams by any means, but it's a pretty heavyweight disc. It's definitely not an RCA Dynaflex at all. Pretty heavyweight disc, and it's in really good condition for being a Goodwill find. Usually the Goodwill finds I have are pretty much trashed. They have no inner sleeves or anything. Water damage, they smell bad. But this was definitely something interesting. And I could tell they actually put in some new vinyl, because I found a really interesting funk album from the U.S. Navy Band, which might be something we talk about on this channel. But yeah. That's pretty much all I've got for now. This has been, Golden Avatar, A Change of Heart. Definitely go check this out. If you can find one for a good price, definitely pick it up. That's been all I have to say. My thoughts, feelings, and ideas. This has been RNC Music, and I will catch you in the next one. I'm out.